Hello, everyone. I've been getting a couple of questions for help with interpreting these documents, which normally we would do in the classroom together as a group or in groups, and then talk about it and have a little assignment on it and the whole thing. And it occurs to me now that I've talked to a few folks that sometimes jumping right into interpreting 200-year-old documents is a difficult thing to do for people that may not have seen these before and don't have direct assistance. Don't have a classroom wherein we're already talking about it and explaining it. So this assignment goes on for a bit, and I wanted to just do a quick tutorial on how to read these and what some of the bits and pieces mean. All of the words that are used in these documents are still used today. It's just that they're not used as often or in the same way. And that's just the nature of reading things that people wrote a long time ago. History and historians always have to do a lot of this stuff. They have to look at something and then interpret it in a way for what it means by tone and how the words are used. And sometimes we have to look up dictionaries and encyclopedias on what words meant back in a certain time. The worst is when you have to do Shakespearean stuff. Good Lord. That that is when things get really crazy. Anyway, this is only 200 years ago, and that's not nearly as bad. So I think the sentiments will make a lot of sense. This part you can read already, the background, which is last week and going into this week, where we have the French Indian War slash 7 Years War that was happening, and the result of that was that the British are in need of more money because the 7 Years War, again, there's two names to it: the 7 Years War and the French Indian War. Depends on where you are as to what it's called. Is that war resulted in a win for the British, and they now have an empire more so than they had before. But they have to pay for it, and to find a way to pay for it, as well as paying off a lot of debt from that 7 Years War, the British have to do something, to change how they make their money. So what the British first decide to do is right around 1764, they decide that they're going to put taxes on certain imported goods. And if you remember in the lecture, the whole talk about mercantilism, you'll know that there's a cycle that America and the American colonies and Britain have. And that cycle is real simple. The colonies exist to produce raw goods. And in fact, there are laws in place that force those colonies to do nothing but produce raw goods. The colonies are not allowed to make manufactured goods because there's part of the whole plan. All right. So the colonies make raw goods and then they send those raw goods to Britain. And then Britain's skilled labor, their factory system of the time and their skilled labor have jobs because they have these colonies making the raw goods. So those guys in Britain, the skilled labor produces out of the raw goods from America and other colonies that Britain has manufactured goods, and that might be tools, and that might be paint, and that might be machinery, and that might be weaponry, and that might be luxury goods like pottery and furniture and all of that stuff, right? It's just all the manufactured goods for the society of the time that you would go into the mall or whatever today or on Amazon and buy. And that's something that the British people are making. But back during the 1400s and 1500s, Britain was in deep trouble because they had a lack of resources. They're an island. In fact, they're only part of an island. So they had a lack of resources, and you can't make things if you don't have raw goods, and that's why the colonies happened for Britain. So Britain has colonies. It's 180 years later, and Britain is now at the end of the 7 Years War, 1764, and they say, nah, let's go ahead and start taxing the colonies some more because we need them to pay their fair share of being part of this big empire. Now, here's the thing. In and you need to apply your knowledge here of the other bit, which had to do with salutary neglect. From 1609, the date of the first successful colonies being founded in Jamestown, all the way to 1764, from that time, 1609 to 1764, Britain's policy of rule of her colonies was that of salutary neglect, which was they pay their taxes that we ask them to pay, but they will basically govern themselves and they will decide, the colonists themselves decide what they want to, or how they want to pay their taxes. So we say to the colonies in general, Britain needs this much money from you this year in taxes, and the colonists will go to their people and raise taxes on certain things that will make the money and send the money to Britain, and that's how they do it. So the colonies were paying taxes, but the colonies were also able to decide how to pay those taxes. That's the representation thing. And the colonies had no need to have the British directly rule them. And the British couldn't directly rule them. They were 4,000 miles away on the island of Britain. So how do you do that, right? And so the colonies, the 13 American colonies, being the earlier colonies the British set up, were used to basically governing themselves for the most part. This is all part of the lecture, okay? So they were used to governing themselves, and the American colonists were used to paying taxes, but only through a process by which Britain said, "Here's the amount we need," and the colonists themselves decide how to tax themselves to pay for it. And that gave the colonists a certain amount of autonomy, a certain amount of freedom that they really, really loved, to the point where the colonists had gotten used to it. And the Enlightenment period had happened, and all the stuff from John Locke, life, liberty, and property, and all these other deals. Again, part of the lectures. If you haven't seen them, this will make a lot less sense than otherwise. And that brings us to this. So when we start here, here's the question. You always want to start with the question so you know what you're reading for. What are the views of this colonial American to the Stamp Act? Now, we could ask a lot of other questions, such as who is this guy talking to? What is his audience, and what kind of language is he using to help you know that? And all that. We're not really getting into that for this. We just want to know, what does this guy think about it? Now, John Dickinson is a very wealthy American. If you Google him, he was a landowner. He was a member of the Continental Congress. He served in the military of the colonies during the War of Independence. The man was a wealthy dude. And so when he said things, he spoke the way wealthy people speak to other wealthy people. So the words he uses and the tone he uses is one of a very educated person speaking to other people with the same education and the same background. Okay, so you're not going to get this entire thing unless you really understand how these guys wrote, but you can get the idea of it, right? And remember, the question is really simple. This is basic. What are the views of this colonial American to the Stamp Act? The first major tax that the British raised on American trade without the consent of the Americans. This is a change. Yes, the British would ask Americans to pay money, but remember, the Americans got to choose how they paid it every year. However, now we're looking at the British just saying, we're just going to not get your opinion. We're just going to start raising taxes on our own on your stuff, and we're going to make you pay for it. So this is where the Americans are like, wait a minute, if the British are just going to start raising taxes on goods as opposed to just saying, here's how much money we need, pay that money by the end of the year. Instead, the British are saying, no, you're going to pay a tax on this and on this and on this and on this. When that starts to happen, then American autonomy or independence of self-rule starts to break down, and Americans liked that. They loved it. They were into it. So they didn't want to, again, it wasn't about whether or not they wanted to pay taxes to Britain. It was about how they were told to pay taxes to Britain. That's where we get. So what we have is John Dickinson talking about a bunch of ships in the harbor from Britain carrying goods that were made out of American raw materials mostly, and these ships are carrying goods that have been converted into manufactured products and were now going to be sold in the colonies, or were supposed to be. However, they all have the Stamp Act on them, the stamp tax, meaning it's a sales tax, really. Okay, so here's what Dickinson says, and I'm just going to kind of explain it as I go. The Stamp Act, therefore, is to be regarded only as an experiment of your disposition. If you know what that means, it just means that the Stamp Act is an experiment of will, meaning it only exists if you actually choose to let it exist. That's what he's saying. All right, he's getting very Confucius on us here. If you quietly bend your necks to that yoke, I think a better way to put it today might be if you quietly bend your knee to that yoke, in a Game of Thrones analogy, right? But next to that yoke, a yoke is that thing that goes around oxen that you would tie all the ropes to, that then tie to a cart or a plow. Basically, a service animal for farming. All right. So if you quietly bend your neck to that yoke, you prove yourselves ready to receive any bondage to which you're, and then he actually did this, so he's being kind of snide here, lords and masters shall please to subject you. Let's break this down. The Stamp Act, therefore, sales taxes on British goods that were not agreed to by the colonists, is to be regarded as an experiment of your will. If you go ahead and just buy these British products, you're basically saying that you're willing to pay that tax and you're willing to do whatever the British tell you, regardless of rules and tradition and everything. You're just willing to let the British put you into any kind of bondage that they wished to impose upon you. That's what he's saying. And this is very fiery stuff. And we're all used to fiery stuff because we just came out, and some of us, I guess, are still in it. I don't know. Came out of a very raucous election cycle over the past several years. And everybody's been speaking partisanly, and screaming at each other on Twitter and Facebook and in person. And that's just the way it is. You mix a loud administration in the presidency with a loud administration, or sorry, loud people in both sides of Congress, and then you throw in a pandemic, and what you have are people screaming at each other. And so this is really not unusual to you, having somebody use such black and white terms, such, if you are this, then you are that, but if you do this, then you are that kind of terminology. So this guy is obviously being very kind of harsh on the idea. If you pay British taxes that we have not agreed to pay through tradition, then you are basically saying, hey, Britain, come and do anything you want. Okay. And he calls them lords and masters, right? Okay. Let's go down. Some persons perhaps may fondly hope it will be as easy to obtain a repeal, meaning to get rid of the Stamp Act after it is put in execution, as if the execution of it is avoided. So he's saying, some people are just saying, let's just let it go and we'll petition Parliament in England, and at some point we'll just get them to overturn the Stamp Act. Okay, that's what he's saying. Now, some people may fondly believe that it'll be easy to repeal the Stamp Act after it's begun. But be not deceived, says Dickinson. The late ministry publicly declared it was intended to establish the power of Great Britain to tax the colonies. The ministry exists to establish the power to directly tax the colonies. Can we imagine then that when so great a point is carried and we have tamely submitted, that any other ministry will propose, or that Parliament will consent to pass an act to renounce this advantage? This is really, you can, again, this guy's a very educated dude speaking in very educated tongue and using a lot more words than are necessary. All this part means, you guys, is governments, once they gain power, do not give it up. That's all that means. So, although some people might think, oh, it'll be really easy to repeal the right, the Britain's Stamp Act and all that and go back to normal, he's saying, don't fool yourselves. Once a government imposes a tax on you, that tax will never go away. Once a government gains power over you in some way, the government will not just give that power up. Power and money. Those are the two most important things in government. So he's just saying that this part is not necessarily necessary for this question, okay? But you can get the idea here, that what he's saying is that we need to be worried about the fact that the British government is probably not going to just get rid of this if we allow them to suddenly start taxing us willy-nilly. Okay, he says, then going on, let me get rid of this highlight. Going on, whoops. Power is of a tenacious nature, and if you know what that means, it just means it's hard to really well, let me just read it. Power is of a tenacious nature. What it seizes, it will retain. So it's like the the arms of an octopus that suck onto its prey. Once it grabs something, it doesn't really just give up. So he then gets into the poetry part of this thing. This part is my favorite part, and really, this part here is the only part you actually need to answer this question. All right, because I just gave you one real basic question here. What are the views of this colonial American to the Stamp Act? Now you could already say he doesn't like it, and he's worried that it'll be hard to get rid of once people get used to it. Okay, you could say that already as part of your answer. But the most important part is right here. Rouse yourselves, therefore, my dear countrymen. This is his call to arms. Think of the endless miseries you must entail upon yourselves and your country by touching the pestilential, meaning disease, cargoes that have been sent to you. Destruction lurks within them. To receive them is death. It is worse than death. It is slavery. This guy, oh, he's having so much fun here. So, what he's doing here is he's equating, in his unique way, of course, he's equating paying British taxes on British goods that are in the harbors, in those cargoes of those cargo ships coming from Britain. He says if you buy those goods and pay those taxes without protest, then basically you're allowing the British to kill you, or really worse, to enslave you. Is this going a bit far? It's going against tradition that Britain and America, the American colonies, have had for nearly 180 years. But is it going too far? Probably, right? It's just his view of it, and what you can say is the British definitely have not made the case that they have the right, to guys like this, to educated landowners in America, that it is okay for them just to change the rules of the relationship between Britain and the colonies. And the result is you have people saying that British taxes on Americans is slavery. There's your answer. Okay. How about this one? Analyze the resolution of the colony of New York. Again, this one is legal stuff. This is a bunch of people, a legal body. So there's lots of legal words. Your job is just to suss out what's in here. All right. It's just to kind of figure out what basically they're saying. All right. So don't try to understand every single word. Get the idea. There's only one question here. Again, how did American colonists respond to the stamp tax? This is the same one from up here. Okay. And why would this response eventually force Britain to repeal, to actually get rid of the tax? Okay, so who's the people speaking? It's a merchants meeting. These are people that are merchants. What's their job? Well, first of all, they're in New York. It's the biggest colony in all the colonies. It has the biggest seaport, very important colony. By the way, when the War of Independence actually does start, this is where the British first land. They send 30,000 troops right into New York City, take it over within 2 weeks, sending George Washington and the Continental Army fleeing across the Delaware River to go hide out in New Jersey, of all places. So, New York City, extremely important harbor. And this is where the merchants of that extremely important harbor have met. The merchants meeting. Again, these are basically your shopkeepers, your warehouse owners, your wharf managers, your ship owners. These are people that actually buy and sell things, including British goods that are sitting in the harbor aboard British ships. Look at the beginning. Already your answer is sitting here if you know what this means. If you're willing to see it. Non-importation agreement. Okay? Non-importation agreement. Merchants have met and they have decided upon a non importation agreement. The only other word for that is boycott, folks. That's the answer to this. But let's read it. October 31st, 1765, resolved that in all orders they send out to Great Britain for goods or merchandise of any nature, kind, or quality whatsoever, usually imported from Great Britain, they will direct their correspondence not to ship them unless the Stamp Act be repealed. All this means, folks, is that American agents that are in Britain are going to be told not to buy or order British goods to go to America to be sold, because Americans are not going to be selling those things or buying those things. These are merchants in the biggest city of the colonies saying, nope, we're boycotting. We're not going to be buying British goods as long. And here it is. Here is the other part of the answer. Let me read this part. Number three, we, the underwritten, the retailers of goods, again, the merchants, do hereby promise and oblige yourselves, they're promising, not to buy any goods, wares, or merchandises of any person or persons whatsoever that shall, this is a typo, be shipped from Great Britain after the first day of January next, unless the Stamp Act be repealed. So, guys, mercantilism, the whole British economy is based on raw goods coming from one place and manufactured goods going back. If you take one entire cog out of that machine, everything breaks down. The entire British system of economy, of manufacture, of sales, of everything. You stop the trade if people stop buying British goods, including 2 million colonists in the American colonies. then what's going to happen is the mercantilist system, the British economy, is going to suffer. And this is not the right time for the British economy to suffer because they have to pay off that giant war. They just won the 7 Years' War. So this is the answer. How did American colonists respond to the Stamp Acts? Well, in this case, merchants met in New York, and others will follow suit in other cities once this happens. Merchants met in New York and agreed not to import British goods. Boom. Okay. Why would this response eventually force Britain to repeal the tax? I have already described that, but if you didn't catch it, I will leave that to you to figure out because I could only do so much. I might be answering too much. All right. How about this one? So, introduction. In 1766, the Stamp Act is repealed by British Parliament due to the protests. So, there you go. The Americans won. Okay. Guys like Dickinson, who was angry and talking about yokes and slavery, and merchants like those in New York who said, we're just not going to buy British goods again. We're going to boycott. That worked. So, the Americans won. The Stamp Act is repealed by Parliament, and boom. However, the next year, a new prime minister takes over, a guy named Lord Townshend. And Townshend, ladies and gentlemen, was an idiot. Okay. If there is any one person to blame possibly for the War of Independence, this is the guy. All right. Because there were lots of people who were kind of like, nah, we solved the problem. It's all good. Britain's our not Lord and Master, but we're part of this great British Empire. We should be happy about that. And they protect us and we work with them and we're from them anyway and all this stuff. And, Britain's part of this empire. But then Townshend walks in and treats the American colonists like absolute dirt. All right. And when that happens, you're going to see more Americans than ever before go, why are we part of Britain again? All right. So these questions, again, they're sort of easy and sort of hard, depending on what you know. And this is the part that I would usually go over in class. Again, always start with the questions. Section 1. What is the main reason for the Townshend Acts? Well, let's go ahead and look. Section 1. Purpose of the Townshend Act. Got to read the legalese again. Here it is. Good times. It is expedient that a revenue should be raised in America for making a more certain and adequate provision, meaning to pay for the civil government and to pay for defending it. Okay, guys, in all the lectures you've read so far, or you've seen so far, that we've had the last couple of weeks, especially, you might notice that American colonists have already had governments. They're already ruling themselves. They've got a royal governor, and then they have elected assemblies, and they govern themselves just fine. Okay, they don't need someone to come and tell them how to rule themselves. Americans are happy with that. They like their system of autonomy from Britain while being part of the British Empire. So when we look at this, what it's saying is kind of interesting, and I'm going to say it in a different way. But I'm just going to read it again. It is expedient that money should be raised for making a more certain and adequate provision to pay for the civil government. What this is talking about, folks, I'm just going to say this and then let you decide what this means, is the British are charging the colonists money through taxes so that the British could put in a new government over the colonies. To put that in other words, imagine yourself being about 40 years old, hopefully living on your own. Maybe you have a family, maybe you have a job, you have a career at the age of 40. All that stuff is happening, right? I'm moving far, far ahead. This may all happen for you far sooner than 40, depending on who you are and what you're doing. I don't know. But let's say you're 40 years old, you're living on your own, and you've got your job, you may have a family, you're doing your own thing, you got your own traditions, the whole deal, and then your parents pull up in an RV and move into your house, and they start charging you money to live with you. So they force you to pay them money, and then they start telling you what to do, and they treat you at 40-year-old or whatever like a high school student again, because that's the relationship they're used to with you. They start telling you how to cook. They start telling you how to clean. They tell you how to raise your kids. They tell you when you're allowed to go out and come home. They start looking through your things. Okay? I want you to imagine that that is happening and how you would react to it normally. Okay? So this already is terrifying when it shows up in the American colonies, and we have this thing called the Townshend Revenue Act, which just means it's Prime Minister Lord Townshend's way to raise money, revenue. Okay, here it is, the year after the stamp tax is repealed, and the colonists are like, okay, we're done, everything's good, we're all happy and friendly now, yay! And then this stupid thing happens. We're going to raise money so that we can replace the government of the Americans. Okay. Next question. What sorts of items does the township tax apply to? Well, it's lead and glass and white lead and painter's colors, meaning paint, and tea. All right, so ignore the stuff where it says hundredweight of red lead. Don't worry about that. That's just what it is. All right, so what, like how much it is, and we don't say things like that every hundredweight. We talk in tons of stuff, but it's red lead and green glass and white lead. Lead is what they used to put in paint, to help paint. So these are manufactured goods that come from Britain that people could live without. You could live without tea, maybe. You can live without painter's colors, like paint. You could live without glass and stuff. So these are not major things. It's just that they're very common things, and so Americans, they could avoid these things. They could just not buy this stuff. It's just, well, the reason why this tax is there is very scary to people. The idea that the British have decided after 180 years of American self rule, mostly, that they can just walk in and force Americans to pay for getting rid of their own governments and having the British rule them directly. Americans don't want to do that. They've grown apart from that system. They don't understand that. Over the past 180 years, guess what? Americans have been defending, protecting, and securing their own dominions. All right, there's 2 million Americans now, and they've been handling their own problems without the British there to do it. Okay, that's why they're all armed. They don't need this. So Americans don't see this. Even the Americans that were pro Britain were not happy about this. This was going way too far. All right, so let's go to number 3. What other powers does the Townshend Act give to the king's officers in the colonies, and how might the colonists respond to this? This is the part that's going to lead directly to people wanting to rebel. This leads right to your Hamilton story, if you saw that. Okay, the play. Um, the British are going to show up with soldiers, and they're going to force the Americans to pay for those soldiers, which is part of creating a new government. An act for preventing frauds. Okay, basically, Townshend is expecting Americans to find ways not to pay taxes because they don't agree with it and they're angry about it. So this is supposed to be the part, the enforcement clause. All right, an act of Parliament made by the 14th year of the reign of Charles II, blah blah blah, an act for preventing frauds and regulating abuses in His Majesty's customs. Customs just has to do with trade. All right, His Majesty's customs. Okay, so this is good times. And you could just kind of read and skip around until you find what you actually need, because that's how you do this stuff. So, it is lawful for any officer of His Majesty's Customs, basically, that's anybody wearing a red uniform, okay, authorized by writ of assistance, so that means a type of warrant from a judge, okay, to take a constable or other public, by public they just mean a public officer like a policeman, unto the place, oh, and a constable is like a sheriff, unto the place, and in the daytime to enter and go into any house, shop, cellar, warehouse, or room, or other place, so anything, and in case of resistance, to break open doors, chests, trunks, and other packages there, to seize and from thence to bring any kind of goods or merchandise whatsoever that we don't think you've paid enough taxes on, and to basically put those in a separate storehouse and keep them. Guys, guys, unreasonable search and seizure much? To take an officer and break into your homes, your businesses, your boxes and chests and trunks, and take your stuff because we've decided you don't get to have them. All right? This is the part that matters here. The rest of this is just more of the rule, all right, and who pays for it and what happens and the whole thing. This is the answer. So check that part out very quickly, and I want you to think about, if the government started doing this today, if the government instantly, if who's the president now, Joe Biden, if President Biden passed a rule today that said, "Oh, I've by the way, I've made it legal for anybody associated with the courts or law enforcement to be able to just to walk in your home, and flash a badge and walk into your home and just take stuff that they don't think you should have. Cool? And just imagine how Americans would react to that. All right? They're going to react to this the same way. Understand? Okay. How about this one? This is one of the reactions of people, the Boston Massacre. Boston Massacre. I'm asking you to look at this, and then there's actually going to be more of a description of this in the next lecture. But if you look at this, what you're looking at, I hope, is you see British soldiers on one side firing their muskets into a bunch of colonists on the other side. And don't forget that there's a little dog here. That's yeah. If you want to make good propaganda, always put a dog in there. All right, a little dog. People care about that more than anything. So, Boston Massacre from a Boston newspaper is trying to get the reader to understand what's going on here. So if you look at this, you can come to your own conclusion. What does it seem like is happening? So just answer these and just know that you're going to get the real answers in the next lecture. What seemed to be happening? Who seems to be the aggressor according to the image? And how might the colonists who see this in their local newspapers think about the British? They already are mad about this, and the colonists are mad about all this. So what happens if the colonists all throughout the 13 colonies open up their newspapers and see this as an account of something that happened? How are they going to start to react to it? Understand? So just write down what you think is going on here and then know that in the next lecture, this will be answered and you'll be able to update that in your answer sheet or whatever. Okay, the Tea Act. All right, this happens. Here we go, 1773. So we're moving on now. The Tea Act is passed by Parliament on May 10th, which will launch the final spark to the revolutionary movement in Boston. Now we're talking about Boston. I'll tell you why in the next lecture about the revolution, why Boston's the place. Okay, Boston is a hotbed of aggression and angry people. And while other colonial capitals were like that too, they weren't to the level of Boston. Boston was next level. Let's put it that way. They were angry people, okay? Meaning about this stuff. They didn't like their rights being trampled on. So Boston was sort of a center place of the reactions to British policy that was unadvised, okay? So the Tea Act was just a simple tax upon tea, but mostly it was no real tax. What the Tea Act was something very unique. The company that handled trade between Britain and all of her colonies around the world was something called the East India Company. You can see this if you ever watch the what is it, Pirates of the Caribbean movies. Those people in there, besides the pirates, all the British officers and all that. Those are all people that work for not the British government. They all work for the British East India Company, which had its own military and everything. It's almost like if Amazon had its own military. Oh God, let's hope that doesn't happen. If we can move to that kind of era where companies have militaries, we're in deep trouble. Okay, so here we are, which was near bankruptcy and burdened with 18 million pounds. The East India Company was in near bankruptcy. Okay, it had a bunch of unsold tea, and so what happened here, guys, is that members of Parliament have, the British government, they have to get rid of all this stuff. They have to get rid of the Townshend Act, and Townshend's going to be fired from Parliament because he makes the colonists so mad with this stupid move here. This ridiculously dumb thing. He really did not understand the colonists at all. What a moron, right? And the Britain has repealed the stamp tax. Britain has repealed a tax that we haven't talked about here, but is in the lecture, the sugar tax. Britain has repealed the Townshend Act and fired Lord Townshend from Parliament. And all they're going to do now, they're like, okay, well, let's try to make some money. God. And so they say, we have all this tea in India, this tea made in India that's just sitting in our warehouses in Britain, and nobody's buying it, and it's getting old, and we need to sell it to somebody. So let's just dump it on the American market at like half the price, and Americans will buy it, and we'll at least make some money from that, and we'll just call it a day. Ugh, this whole thing's been just such a mess. Well, the problem is that this was done just like the rest of these acts without thinking about what it would do to Americans. All right. This is always what happens when you only see your side and never look at the other side. So the East India Company is going to dump of the tons of unsold cruddy tea, old cruddy tea, on the American market at pennies on the dollar. That seems like a good thing, right? Americans win. They get a bunch of cheap tea and no taxes, right? Yay! Well, here's what happens. Americans are already mad because they're still angry about this stuff. They haven't just gone, "Oh, let's go have a snow day and hang out and play and come back and we're all happy now, after some therapy or something." Americans are still angry about the way the British have been treating them, and they've been waiting for like the next shoe to drop, if you will. And so this suddenly happens. A bunch of ships show up and they dump a bunch of cheap tea on the American market. Here's the problem: Americans already have their own tea industry. So when Britain dumped all this cheap tea on the American market, they destroyed the American tea industry. Okay? So let me just read this part. The direct sale of tea via British agents in the colonies undercut the businesses of local merchants and added to the anger already in place by the Townshend Acts. So basically, Britain had an interesting idea, but they didn't carry it out right, and they just dumped all this tea on the American tea market, and the American tea market will collapse and leave people without jobs, and whole trade will collapse, and that's going to make Americans mad. Look at how badly the British are managing this stuff. We're so mad, right? So you can read about what happened. That's the Tea Act, okay? And then this one is just a guy who was there talking about what happened when they went to destroy a bunch of tea that was waiting for them in protest of this happening. Okay, and I don't think I need to describe this. I think it's pretty obvious what's going on here. The guy speaks very plainly and straightly because he's not a lawyer. All right, and then the coercive acts is the British response to the Boston Tea Party. I think you could probably figure out what this means too. By the way, the word coercive, for those of you that might be not used to that word, just means to force someone to do something. So the coercive acts. We will force the Americans to do this thing, coerciveness. All right. And then finally, we have the Declaration of Independence passed, and this is why it's passed. All of this stuff is why it's passed. And half of the Declaration of Independence that you probably never see is on the second page. This is the first half, and then the second half is just this giant list. And this is only some of them. It's just this giant list of things the Americans are ticked off about. All right, that's all it is. It's just this bullet list on the other page. So go ahead and finish up, but hopefully describing what this stuff is will help you get through that assignment, which will continue next week as you get into the lecture, and there's more of a uh, well, there's going to be a lot pulled from this, really, to help you understand, I hope, why the colonists were angry in the first place. Okay, that's all this is about. Sorry this was so long, and I hope it helped a little bit. Go get some points and know that you're going to be able to revise this stuff if you want to next week after the lecture, and you really get an idea of how this all works. Okay, thanks a lot, folks.